It was a rainy Thursday afternoon, and the Grand Station was crowded with travelers brushing past one another like waves in a storm. Luggage wheels clattered, umbrellas dripped across marble floors, and echoes of train announcements filled the air. Among them stood a man whose tailored suit didn't quite belong in the chaos, a man used to chauffeurs, private lounges, and silence. His name was Alan Montgomery, millionaire, CEO, unapologetically arrogant. He was waiting for someone. A woman he had matched with on a private, invitation-only dating app. Someone with class, according to her profile. A lawyer, educated, wealthy. Exactly the kind of woman Alan's status demanded. He looked at his watch impatiently. That's when he saw her. She was standing near a bench, drenched, trying to shield a paper bag from the rain. She was clearly not dressed for a date. Hair tied up in a loose bun, a faded uniform under her jacket. A waitress, maybe. But her eyes, tired, sharp, and unafraid, locked with his for half a second. Alan, distracted, stepped forward. "Claire?" he asked, mistaking her completely. The woman looked confused. "I think you've got the wrong person," she replied softly. But it wasn't her rejection that froze him. It was her voice, calm, composed, as if she had nothing to prove. Most women looked at him with either admiration or intimidation. This one looked uninterested. He gave a curt nod, mumbled an apology, and turned away. But something inside him hesitated. He looked back. The woman was still standing there, still soaked, still holding her bag like it contained something precious. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Alan asked, "You need a ride?" She looked at him, really looked, and said, "People like you don't offer rides unless they want something. So no, thank you." That hit him like a slap. She didn't care who he was. She didn't want anything from him. And that was new. He didn't know then, but this accidental encounter with the wrong woman would tear apart everything he thought he understood about love, power, and humanity. Alan couldn't stop thinking about her. The moment he returned to his penthouse that evening, surrounded by polished floors, curated silence, and the soft hum of automated comfort, her words echoed louder than anything. "People like you don't offer rides unless they want something." It wasn't the insult that stayed with him. It was the truth in it. He had lived so long in a world where every gesture had a price, where generosity was either strategic or staged, that her refusal had unsettled something in him. He didn't even know her name. The next day, under the pretense of a casual detour, Alan returned to the station. This time, no tailored date to meet, no expectations, just a quiet hope to see her again. And there she was, outside a nearby coffee shop, in the same faded uniform, now serving drinks with a patient smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The paper bag she had protected yesterday now sat behind the counter, crumpled, like it had already told its story. He stood in line, unfamiliar with ordering anything himself. When it was his turn, she looked at him blankly, not recognizing him at first. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "Whatever you recommend," he replied, resisting the urge to say something clever. She raised an eyebrow, as if that was the laziest answer of the day, but turned and began preparing something anyway. When she handed him the drink, he offered a quick "thanks," then moved to the corner of the small cafe, pretending to scroll his phone while watching her in the reflection of the glass window. It wasn't long before her shift ended. She untied her apron and stepped outside, clearly unaware he was still there. Alan followed her out, unsure why he cared so much. "You were right yesterday," he said suddenly, startling her. "I did expect something." She looked at him now, really looked, and replied, "Then why are you back?" He shrugged. "Because I don't know why it bothered me so much that you said no." That made her pause. She crossed her arms, the breeze picking up around them. "Maybe because you're not used to hearing no." There was silence for a moment. The street behind them buzzed with life. Buses hissing to a stop, people rushing with coffee and complaints, but between them, it was still. "Do you always speak this directly?" he asked. "Do you always expect people to pretend around you?" She shot back, but without malice this time. He smiled, not the polished, practiced smile from corporate meetings, but something unfamiliar even to himself. "Can I buy you coffee?" he asked. "I just spent 8 hours making it," she replied, but after a beat she nodded toward the bench across the street. "But you can sit and drink that one while I eat my leftover sandwich." And just like that, the conversation that wasn't supposed to happen became the moment everything quietly shifted. For the first time in a long while, Alan felt like he wasn't the one leading, and he didn't mind at all. Later that evening, Alan sat across from Claire, the woman he had originally planned to meet through the private dating app. She was stunning in the exact way high society appreciated, refined, polished, and dressed in quiet luxury. The rooftop restaurant glowed with soft amber lights, and the table had been reserved weeks in advance. Everything was perfect, on paper. Yet as Claire talked, Alan found himself staring through the wine glass, not at her, but at the space between them. Her voice was pleasant, her posture flawless, but her words, well, they felt rehearsed. She spoke about vacations, handbags, and the frustrations of her housekeeper, as if these were the world's greatest injustices. He smiled when appropriate, nodded where expected, and made polite conversation. But his mind kept drifting back to the coffee shop, to the waitress who spoke like she had nothing to lose. The one who challenged him, the one who didn't adjust her tone to flatter or impress. There had been something raw and real in her presence, something that now made this evening feel eerily artificial. Claire asked about his work, and when he started explaining a recent merger, her interest faded within seconds. She quickly pivoted to a story about a designer store being out of her shoe size. Alan realized she wasn't really listening. She wasn't here for him. She was here for the version of him that matched her lifestyle. The status, the access, the curated identity of Alan Montgomery, billionaire CEO. And for the first time in years, he was starting to feel like that version of himself wasn't enough. Not to someone who mattered. As dessert arrived, he excused himself to the restroom, but he didn't go. Instead, he stood at the far end of the balcony, looking out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled like they always had, but tonight, they felt distant. He pulled out his phone, instinctively scrolling through contacts he had never truly connected with, searching for something, or someone, that made him feel grounded again. He thought about the way the waitress had looked at him, not with awe or resentment, but with clarity. Like she saw right through the wealth, the posture, the empty gestures, and somehow, instead of feeling insulted, he felt relieved, seen. Returning to the table, he found Claire still scrolling her own phone, casually sipping champagne. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't even notice he had left. That was the moment. It wasn't loud or dramatic. But in the quiet hollowness of that date, Alan felt something settle deep inside him, a truth he couldn't ignore. This world he had built, the image he had perfected, the people he surrounded himself with, they were shadows, echoes, pretty surfaces without depth. He looked at Claire one last time and smiled, not out of affection, but understanding. He knew now that the connection he truly craved wasn't found in wealth or prestige. It was found in a drenched coffee shop on a quiet bench beside a woman who never wanted anything from him at all. Alan had never been one to dwell on people. In his world, emotions were liabilities, and time was money. But something about her refused to let go. Days passed, but his mind remained anchored to the woman from the cafe, the one who spoke plainly, who didn't smile to please, who challenged him with just her presence. He told himself it was curiosity, maybe pride. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't stop thinking about her. So he did what any man with resources would do. He looked into her. Not obsessively, but methodically. It started with the cafe. He asked one of his assistants to discreetly find the employee schedule. Her name was Ava. No last name on file. But that was all Alan needed. Within hours, he had a report. Names, addresses, former education, and gaps that told their own story. Ava Rodriguez, former scholarship student at a prestigious university, top of her class, a double major in literature and philosophy, once selected for an elite fellowship abroad, but she had turned it down abruptly, just weeks before departure. After that, her records went dark, no graduation, no formal employment, a sudden drop from excellence into obscurity. Alan dug deeper. What he found was not scandal, but sadness. Her mother had fallen gravely ill that same year. Medical records showed a lengthy hospital stay. No insurance. Ava had withdrawn from school, forfeited everything, and taken multiple part-time jobs to care for her mother until her final breath. The last remaining family member, a stepbrother, had legally claimed the house afterward, despite it being Ava's childhood home. She had fought it briefly, but the system wasn't kind to those without resources. She lost, and since then she had drifted from city to city, working quietly, never staying long enough to be noticed. Alan stared at the report for a long time. He imagined the bright, ambitious girl she had once been, and the quiet strength it took to let all of that go for the sake of someone she loved. In his world, people didn't make sacrifices without strategy. They gave only when it benefited them. But Ava had lost everything, willingly, and never spoke a word about it. She hadn't asked for sympathy. She hadn't even told her story. Yet she carried the weight of it in her eyes, in the stillness of her movements, in the way she guarded herself without bitterness. He felt something stir in him, not pity, but respect, deep, uncomfortable respect. Alan closed the report. He could have reached out then, confessed what he had done, but it didn't feel right. She didn't need saving. She had already survived what most would crumble under. But perhaps she could use a little space to breathe. So he decided, in his own quiet way, to open a few doors behind the curtain. Nothing grand, nothing obvious. Just enough to tilt the world ever so slightly back in her favor, without her ever knowing who had touched it. Alan had never done anything anonymously in his life. Every donation, every gesture of goodwill, every act of charity had always come with a plaque, a headline, or at the very least, a nod of acknowledgement. That was the world he had lived in, where kindness was currency and recognition its reward. But this was different. This wasn't about showing the world his generosity. It was about doing something good simply because it felt right, and more importantly, because she would never ask for it herself. The first thing he did was call the landlord of the small apartment building Ava lived in. It wasn't hard to find. The report he had read earlier had all the details. The landlord was behind on some repairs, especially in Ava's unit, where a broken heater had gone unfixed for weeks. Alan paid for the repairs through a fake management company and added a credit to her rent anonymously. No notes, no signatures, just warmth, silently returned to her small corner of the world. Next, he contacted the cafe where she worked. Posing as a corporate food reviewer, he left a glowing review of her customer service, which prompted her manager to offer her more hours and a small raise. She never knew why or how it happened. She just shrugged, tied her apron tighter, and showed up with the same quiet grace she always did. He arranged for a few books to be delivered to her address. Literature classics, worn but valuable editions, the kind only someone who truly loved books would appreciate. They arrived in a plain box with no return label. She opened them slowly, turning the pages with a reverence that surprised even her. No card, no explanation, just a gift that spoke directly to the part of her she thought the world had forgotten. Alan watched from afar, never interfering directly. Sometimes, he sat across the street in his car, pretending to take a call, just to catch a glimpse of her leaving work or sitting at the park bench with her sandwich and her thoughts. It wasn't obsession. It was admiration wrapped in distance. He didn't want to impose. He just wanted to make the world a little softer for someone who had endured too much of its sharp edges. His assistant once asked him about the odd requests, the quiet donations, the anonymous packages. Alan simply said, "Some things don't need names attached." And that was it. No grand gestures, no sudden changes in her life. Just small, consistent signs that maybe, just maybe, the universe hadn't entirely forgotten her. Ava, of course, noticed the changes. She wasn't naive, but she had no idea who was behind them. And part of her didn't want to know. Because in a life filled with unanswered prayers and locked doors, this invisible kindness felt like a miracle she didn't need to explain. And that, to Alan, was more rewarding than any thank you ever could be. Eventually, Alan couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. Watching her from a distance, helping in silence. It had been enough for a while. But the feeling kept growing, pressing against his chest like something unfinished. He wanted to speak to her, not as a stranger passing by or a silent benefactor, but as himself. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man who had begun to see the world differently through her. So he returned to the cafe one late afternoon, just as the sun was sliding behind the buildings and casting golden lines across the windows. She was wiping down a table, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, the picture of someone who had never stopped working. When she looked up and saw him, her face didn't change. No surprise, no smile, just steady, patient eyes. "You again?" she said, half amused. He nodded. "I'd like to talk. Outside, if that's okay." A few minutes later, they sat on the same bench they had once shared, the bench where everything had quietly begun. He held a paper bag in his hands, but it wasn't a gift. It was just coffee. One for him, one for her. Equal. "I know things have shifted in your life recently," he began carefully. "The apartment repairs, the books, the hours at work." She narrowed her eyes slightly, listening. "That was me," he said simply. She didn't speak right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Finally, she asked, "Why?" "Because I could. And because I wanted to," he answered honestly. "Not to impress you. Not to make you owe me anything, just because I saw someone who deserved better." She stared at the ground for a moment, and when she looked back up, her eyes weren't angry, but they weren't soft either. "You think giving someone a few comforts is kindness," she said, "but you never asked what I wanted. You just assumed." He opened his mouth, but she stopped him with a look. "I've spent years trying to stand on my own feet, not because I'm proud, but because I need to know that I can. If you really respected me, you would have asked before trying to fix things." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who had been helped too many times without being heard. Alan felt something shift inside him, quiet shame, confusion, and the ache of someone who had meant well and still missed the mark. "I didn't mean to make you feel small," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I've spent enough of my life being managed by others. If you want to be in it, be with me, not above me." It was the first time anyone had ever said something like that to him, and for once, Alan didn't have a ready answer. He just sat there, holding the coffee, realizing that love, real love, wasn't about giving. It was about listening. And she had just taught him that in fewer words than he'd used all year. For a few quiet weeks, things almost felt normal. Ava continued her routine at the cafe, unaware that her every step was being watched over, not with control, but with care. Alan respected her boundaries now, stepping back from interference. They spoke sometimes, sat on the same bench, Shared coffee and silence. No confessions, no declarations. Just a calm understanding building slowly between two people from opposite worlds. But peace, for people like Ava, never lasted long. It began with a letter slipped under her apartment door. No envelope. Just a torn sheet of paper with a name she hadn't seen in years. Marco. Her stepbrother. The one who had taken everything from her after her mother died. The house, the savings, even the little jewelry box that wasn't worth much except sentiment. At first, she ignored it, tossed the paper aside and went about her day. But the next morning, he appeared in person, standing at the cafe's back entrance like a shadow from a life she had buried. He was thinner now, eyes darting nervously, but his voice hadn't changed. Smooth, manipulative, always pretending to care. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I heard things are going better for you now." Ava felt her stomach tighten. "Why are you really here?" He smiled, fake and familiar. "Let's just say, I need a little help. Temporary. Family to family." She laughed, short, bitter. "You're not family. You were just the one who signed the papers and locked me out." Marco's tone shifted then. The charm peeled away. He stepped closer. "Be careful how you speak to people who still know where your scars are." She turned and walked away, heart pounding, knowing full well what that meant. He didn't just want money, he wanted power again. And he knew how to twist her world until it broke. He always had. Over the next few days, she started noticing things. A new customer who stared too long. Her locker at work slightly ajar when she was sure she'd closed it. An envelope of old photographs left at her doorstep. Photos from her childhood, from the house she lost. Marco wasn't asking for help. He was warning her. "I can still reach you." She didn't tell Alan at first. She didn't want him to see her as fragile. But he noticed the change, how her eyes avoided his, how her voice got quieter, her smile forced. One evening, he followed her after work and saw Marco waiting outside her building. The way he spoke to her, the way Ava stood still, shoulders tense, face pale, that was enough. Alan stepped in, calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Marco turned, laughed nervously. "Who are you, her boyfriend?" Alan didn't respond. He simply stepped between them and said, "You're not welcome here. Not now. Not ever." Marco scoffed but backed away, muttering curses under his breath. That night, Ava didn't say thank you. She just sat beside Alan on the bench, silent tears running down her face. And he realized, this wasn't just about helping anymore. This was about protecting someone who had never been protected. Ava had always faced her battles alone. Even when she was younger, no one ever stood in front of her to shield her from harm. Life had taught her to raise her own defenses, to carry her own pain quietly, and to never expect anyone to fight on her behalf. So when Alan stepped in that night outside her building, calm, certain, unwavering, something cracked deep inside her. It wasn't just the relief of seeing Marco leave. It was the way Alan didn't hesitate. As if protecting her wasn't a question, but a promise. Still, Ava wasn't sure it was over, and she was right. A few days later, Marco returned, this time emboldened. He didn't come to her building. He went further, contacted her employer, spreading lies. He claimed Ava was dangerous, unstable, and owed him money. Rumors started floating at the cafe. A few co-workers pulled away. Her manager called her in for a casual chat that felt more like an interrogation. Ava's hands shook as she defended herself, knowing this was how it always started. First doubt, then distance, then dismissal. She left work early that day, heart heavy and thoughts tangled. When Alan called her that evening, she didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how to tell him the storm had returned, and this time, it wasn't just knocking. It was tearing through everything. But Alan wasn't a man who waited for permission when someone he cared about was under attack. The next morning, Ava arrived at the cafe to find Marco already there, loud, theatrical, trying to draw attention. He had brought papers, false claims, and a smug grin that made her stomach churn. That's when Alan walked in, not in a suit, not with bodyguards, just as a man who had seen enough. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He spoke clearly, every word heavy with intention. He revealed documents Marco never expected him to have, evidence of fraud, past complaints, eviction reports, even forged signatures on the house that was once Ava's. Alan had lawyers ready, statements prepared, and witnesses waiting if needed. The manager of the cafe stood nearby, stunned. Customers paused mid-sip. Marco's smirk faded. "I suggest," Alan said, voice even, "you disappear before the law finds you." Marco stammered, realizing too late that this wasn't just a protective boyfriend. This was a man with power, but more importantly, with resolve. He turned and left, stumbling out the door, exposed and deflated. Ava stood frozen, unable to move, unsure of what to feel. The entire cafe was quiet. Alan looked at her, not with pride, not with triumph, but with something gentler. "You don't have to keep fighting alone," he said softly. And for the first time in years, Ava let herself believe that maybe she didn't. She didn't need someone to fix her life. She just needed someone to stand beside her in the moments when everything threatened to fall apart. And today, someone finally did. Alan had always measured value in results. Deals closed, assets gained, empires built. His life had been a ledger, each line carefully calculated, each move planned to increase power or prestige. But ever since Ava entered his world, that ledger no longer made sense. She had no wealth, no name in society, and yet her presence had unraveled the cold arithmetic of his life and replaced it with something far more difficult to define. After the confrontation at the cafe, Alan didn't return to his boardrooms right away. He took time off, something he had never done before without a medical reason or a contractual necessity. Instead of running meetings, he spent quiet mornings walking through ordinary neighborhoods, watching people live lives he had never considered. He noticed how strangers helped each other without cameras, how kindness happened in silence. He realized how blind he had been to a world that didn't orbit around money. He thought of Ava constantly, not because she needed him, but because she didn't. She had taught him that dignity didn't come from wealth, and strength wasn't loud. She had reminded him what it meant to be human in a world obsessed with status. And slowly, Alan began to change. He started attending his own foundation meetings, really attending, not just appearing for photos. He reviewed where the funds were going, demanded transparency, and redirected millions toward small grassroots programs, the kind of organizations that helped people like Ava when no one else did. He didn't announce these changes publicly. There were no press releases, just quiet, meaningful redirection of power toward purpose. At his company, he stepped down from a few leadership roles and promoted individuals who valued ethics over ego. He sold off a massive luxury property he no longer had use for and used the proceeds to fund scholarships, particularly for women from difficult backgrounds. He told no one, not even Ava. And yet, despite all this, the real shift wasn't in his bank statements. It was in the way he showed up, more grounded, more thoughtful. He listened more. He questioned his own instincts. And when he saw Ava, he no longer felt the need to impress or protect. He simply wanted to be present. One afternoon, she noticed him sitting quietly on their usual bench, dressed in a simple jacket, sipping a coffee he had brought for both of them. He wasn't distracted. He wasn't checking his watch. He looked peaceful. "You've changed," she said, watching him carefully. "I didn't know how asleep I was," he replied, his voice quiet. She nodded. "Money makes it easy to sleep through other people's pain." He looked at her then, not as a man who had built a fortune, but as someone finally starting to build a life. "You woke me up," he said. And in that moment, Ava realized his wealth wasn't the most powerful thing he had. It was his willingness to grow, to unlearn, to become more than just rich in assets, but rich in understanding, in humility, and in love. Alan had been raised in a world where love was packaged in extravagant boxes and expressed through lavish gestures. He had seen proposals with orchestras, private jets, and rings so large they made headlines. But none of it felt right for this moment. Not for her, not for them. Ava didn't want opulence. She didn't believe in performance. She believed in truth, the kind that couldn't be bought, rehearsed, or hidden behind diamonds. And Alan, for the first time, understood that the most valuable things were the ones you couldn't measure in carats or currency. He spent days thinking about how to ask her, not just to be with him, but to trust him with her life, after everything. He didn't want to rescue her. He wanted to walk beside her, and he knew that whatever he offered had to reflect that. So he returned to the beginning. The same bench, the same corner by the cafe, the same quiet space where their story had accidentally begun. Ava arrived to find him already sitting there, a paper cup of coffee in each hand and a small folded piece of paper beside him. No flowers, no cameras, just a stillness in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. He handed her the coffee without a word and slid the note toward her. She opened it carefully, expecting something simple, a thank you perhaps, or a reflection. But instead, it was a letter written in Alan's own shaky, unpolished handwriting. No assistant. No formality. It read, "I don't have a diamond for you. Not because I couldn't buy one, but because nothing I own can match the value of who you are. You didn't need me to change your life, but you changed mine. You taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about showing up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's uncertain. So, I'm not asking you to wear a ring today. I'm asking you to sit beside me tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day we're given, not as someone I saved, but as someone who saved me." At the bottom, 2 words were written, not bold, not dramatic. Just, "Will you?" Ava stared at the letter, her heart aching in the most unexpected way. It wasn't the kind of proposal little girls dreamed of. It wasn't fairy tale perfection. It was real, raw, and hers. She looked at Alan, no longer the untouchable millionaire, but a man offering himself without armor. "I don't want a diamond," she said softly, placing the note back in his hand. "I just want this, honesty, and you." He smiled, not with relief, but with quiet gratitude. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, sharing coffee as the sun began to fall. No glittering stone, no audience. Just 2 people, finally choosing each other, with nothing to prove and everything to give. Months passed, but the bench by the cafe never lost its meaning. It became their place, where they met, where they healed, where they rebuilt something neither of them had been looking for, yet both desperately needed. Alan had resumed work, but on his own terms. The man obsessed with profits now measured success by different metrics: quiet evenings, shared meals, moments of real connection. Money still existed in his world, but it no longer defined him. And Ava, once hesitant to trust the future, now walked through it with someone who never tried to carry her, only walk beside her. On a cloudy afternoon, she sat waiting on the same bench, reading one of the old books he'd once sent anonymously. She still didn't wear a ring. She didn't need one. Every day they showed up for each other was the vow they lived by. Alan arrived late, coffee in hand, as always. He sat beside her and passed her a note instead of a cup. Inside it was a single sentence: "Let's go home." And they did. But not to his mansion, not to her old apartment. They had found a small, quiet house on the edge of the city, a place where no one knew them by title or past, where their mornings began with mismatched mugs and their nights ended with shared stories and silence. People wondered why the billionaire had faded from the spotlight, why his name no longer appeared in tabloids or tech conferences. They didn't know that the man who once had everything had finally found what he never knew he needed: a love that grounded him, challenged him, and gave his life depth. Ava never cared about the world he came from, and Alan no longer missed it. One morning, as they sat on their porch, sipping coffee and watching the sunrise stretch over the trees, Alan turned to her and said, "You know, I thought I had everything." Ava raised an eyebrow, teasing. "And now?" He smiled. "Now I actually do." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the sky shift in color, just like their lives had, slowly and beautifully. And that's the truth some people never understand. You can own towers, sign billion-dollar contracts, be chased by headlines and accolades, but it means nothing if your heart is empty. The richest life is not about what you keep. It's about what you give, who you grow with, and who sits beside you when the noise fades away. Alan lost a part of his empire to find a soul worth keeping, and in doing so, he gained the only thing that ever truly mattered. If this story moved you, if you believe that real wealth is built on love, courage, and quiet strength, then you belong here with us. Because on this channel, Rich Revenge, we don't just tell stories about the powerful. We tell stories about the ones who found power in the most unexpected places, like a coffee shop, a quiet bench, and a love that money could never buy. Subscribe to follow more stories like this, stories that touch the heart, change the mind, and remind us what truly matters.